Remember to a series that we did last year, the paradox of faith. And so we described a paradox, what that was, as two things that seemingly contradict, right? Seemingly cannot coexist, but yet they do, that they exist together. Right? And so here in Moses' encounter with God, we actually find another, what we can say is a paradox of the Christian faith. And so, again, a few things that I want to mention and point out. So, first, notice in verse 4 that God, in a very personal manner, calls out to Moses. And he says his name twice, right? Moses, Moses. And this, in fact, is a very personal and individual and specific call. Something that, in fact, God does as a pattern throughout Scripture in calling specific individuals. And so Samuel, for example, 1 Samuel chapter 3, he says, Samuel, Samuel. Or Saul, right, the Apostle Paul in Acts chapter 9, verse 4. He says, Saul, Saul, Jesus calls him. See, God doesn't just say, hey, you, right, come over here. But he calls out to Moses in a very personal and individual way, showing to us that God, in fact, isn't a distant God, that he is a personal God, and he knew Moses personally. As well, we can also look at how God then describes himself in verse 6. So he says in verse 6, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And we can note as well, right, that God identifies himself as the God of Moses' ancestors. That then he is not a new or unfamiliar deity, but he is the God of all of Moses' past ancestors, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and that his holiness then has been consistent throughout all of history. And so you might wonder, well, okay, where's the paradox? I mean, where's the paradox in what we're talking about? Well, herein lies the apparent contradiction. Because on the one hand, like we had just said, we have a holy God who has made it clear to Moses that he is utterly unique. He is set apart. He is morally pure. He tells Moses not to come near him. But yet, at the same time, he also demonstrates a desire to be close to Moses as well, to be personal with him, to relate to and have fellowship with him. Right? You see, that's the apparent contradiction, that God, on the one hand, is set apart, distant. He tells Moses, don't come near me. But yet, on the other hand, he wants Moses to be near him, and he calls Moses to be near him. Right? In other words, what we see of God is this, is that he is holy, but yet intensely personal. Holy, yet intensely personal. God is separate. He is set apart, but yet he is also close. Right? You see, that's the paradox. So when we ask, why does it matter that God is holy? The issue is this. It's because God is holy and because we are not, his holiness, in fact, creates a barrier for people to come to him and to be in his presence. Right? That his holiness creates a barrier. So in a nutshell, this actually explains a lot of why in the Old Testament, God's people had to follow very strict prescribed rituals and laws that were set out by God for his people. It was so that in order for them to then approach and relate to a holy God, that there was no other way for the people to be able to approach and draw close. And then, which in fact then in the New Testament, for us, why then Jesus is central to the Christian faith. Because then through Jesus, he provides the only way to permanently and eternally relate to God. And so, again, going back to our theme, be holy, what I want to set straight as we launch into this exploration is this, is that when God calls you to be holy, he is in fact calling you to himself. He's calling you in a way in order to relate to you, for you to relate to him. And again, this is one of the strange paradoxes of our faith. That on the one hand, we have a holy God separate, but yet a God who desires for us who are not holy, who are separated from him because we're not holy, to be drawn close to him, to have fellowship with him, to know him. Right? That's what we see here with Moses.